In the heart of southern England, a small village lay hidden amidst the undulating countryside, where life had once been simple, tranquil, and free from the looming shadows of war. Yet, as Europe descended into chaos in the late summer of 1939, everything was about to change. The once carefree sounds of children laughing and playing in the village streets were soon overshadowed by the heavy, uncertain silence that now hung in the air. This was not the village they had known. It was becoming something new, a place where patience was no longer merely a virtue but a necessity for survival. It began quietly at first, an undercurrent of tension that was hard to pinpoint but impossible to ignore. In the evenings, as the sun dipped behind the horizon and the sky transformed into a darkening canvas, families gathered together. The flicker of candlelight cast long shadows on the walls of their modest homes, where the smell of warm meals filled the air, masking the underlying anxiety that had slowly started to infect even the calmest among them. The war was still far away, but the whispers of its impending arrival had reached even these isolated corners of the countryside. Sirens, a foreign sound to these people, now became a regular part of their daily lives, a constant reminder that their world had irrevocably shifted. As the village prepared for yet another evening, a heavy unease settled in the pit of many stomachs. The fathers who had been drafted or volunteered for military service were away, leaving mothers and children to face whatever may come. Though life continued, people still visited the local shops, still tended to their gardens, still made small talk with neighbors. The unspoken tension between them was palpable. The rumors that reached the village were vague but dire. The Germans were advancing, and nothing in the path of their blitzkrieg would remain untouched. At first, there had been a sense of disbelief. The idea that this small, peaceful community might be drawn into something so grand and terrible seemed impossible. Yet, as the weeks turned into months, reality began to press against the edges of this small, unsuspecting world. The war had not yet reached their doorstep, but it was knocking louder with each passing day. News arrived not in the form of broadcasts or newspapers, but from the government's warning messages. First, the public service announcements began, rationing instructions, posters about blackouts, and even evacuation plans for children. Then came the drills. Night after night, the people of the village would be reminded that their safety could no longer be guaranteed in a world on the brink of total destruction. But amidst all of this uncertainty, one thing remained clear: there was no escaping the future that was now rushing toward them. It was one particular evening in late summer when the first true signs of war arrived on their doorstep. The day had been a typical one, with the sounds of children playing in the fields and adults attending to their evening chores. The soft rustling of leaves in the trees was punctuated by the occasional clink of a distant tractor or the low murmur of a conversation between neighbors. But as twilight descended, a sharp whistle broke the silence. A distant wail echoed through the air, causing heads to turn in every direction. The sound of the air raid siren was not a simple warning but an announcement of something far more terrifying. This was no longer a precaution. This was a declaration. For the first time, the village could hear the hum of approaching aircraft, too high to be clearly seen but too close for comfort. The rumble of distant explosions reverberated through the earth, sending shivers down spines. The adults quickly turned to each other with uneasy glances, each knowing what was coming, but no one saying a word. Instinctively, the children stopped playing, their faces blank with fear. They had heard their parents speak in hushed tones about the war, about what might happen if the Germans ever reached their shores, but now, standing there in the thickening twilight, it was no longer an abstract fear. It was real. It was imminent. The village, once filled with the sounds of laughter and casual conversation, was now a quiet sea of nervous eyes and hurried movements. The mothers immediately moved toward their children, pulling them close, hugging them tightly as if the simple act of holding them could shield them from what was to come. The children, wide-eyed and trembling, clung to their mothers, seeking comfort in their embrace. Some parents tried to calm their young ones with gentle whispers, but the fear in their own eyes betrayed their best efforts. For many, this was the first real experience with war. For others, it was the first time the theoretical and the personal collided with such force. The world they knew, the world of soft hearths, of schoolyards and simple joys, was fading, replaced by something colder, darker and infinitely more dangerous. In those first few moments, there was no time for thoughts beyond immediate survival. The adults knew the drill: get to safety as quickly as possible. The shelters had been built weeks earlier, under the direction of government officials, but they were no longer mere contingencies. They were a lifeline, the only thing standing between the people and the growing threat in the sky. Families scrambled to gather their belongings, grabbing the essentials: coats, blankets, food, whatever they could carry. The cold weight of fear pressed down upon them as they hurried into the underground shelters, trying to ignore the deafening sound of the sirens and the distant thundering of planes. The air in the shelters was thick with tension, the walls reverberating with the sound of heavy footsteps and whispered prayers. Once inside, the villagers clung together in the dim light, waiting. The children huddled close to one another, their faces pale and drawn, their hands trembling as they tried to make sense of the new world that had descended upon them. The mothers tried to console them with stories, with quiet words of reassurance, but nothing could erase the terror that had gripped their hearts. Even the elders, usually the pillars of strength, sat in silence, knowing that there was little they could say to calm the storm that had now arrived. As the hours stretched on, the night seemed to slow. The village was caught between the uncertainty of the present and the dread of the future. Each minute felt like an eternity, the silence in the shelter occasionally punctuated by the sound of distant explosions. The children clutched one another tightly, finding some small comfort in the shared terror, while the adults stared blankly at the dirt walls, each wondering how long they could endure this. But amid all the fear and uncertainty, one thing became clear: the villagers were not alone. They had something that the enemy could never take from them: a quiet, unspoken strength that had sustained them through generations. It was not a strength of arms, of military might, but a deeper, more enduring force: patience. It was a patience born of centuries of surviving the harsh rhythms of the land, of weathering the storms and seasons that had shaped their lives. And it was that patience that would carry them through the coming days, weeks, and months of hardship. But for now, all they could do was wait in the darkness, hoping that their resilience would be enough. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the cracks in the shelter, the sound of the planes had faded into the distance. The bombing had not come to the village, not yet, anyway. The all-clear siren wailed its eerie relief, and the families slowly emerged from their shelters, blinking in the early morning light. The damage, it seemed, had been minimal, but the fear remained. It was not over. And, in truth, the waiting had just begun. For the people of this small village, the war had not yet arrived in full force, but it would soon. And in that quiet moment, as they stepped back into the world they once knew, they understood that survival would not be defined by how many bombs they could dodge, but by how long they could endure the waiting. The morning after the first air raid siren had sounded, the village felt like a place suspended between two worlds. The night had passed without catastrophe, but the fear lingered in the quiet spaces of the streets and in the hearts of the people. Children, who had huddled in their homes under their parents' protective arms, were now cautiously returning to the outdoor world they had briefly abandoned. But the world they returned to was no longer the same. Everything felt different, as if the very air had changed, charged with a quiet tension that no one dared to speak of directly. The once familiar, peaceful village now carried an unease so subtle, yet so profound, that it seemed to seep into the bones of everyone who walked its dirt paths. Despite the lack of an actual attack, the war was no longer something far away in foreign lands. It had come to their doorstep. The realization that it was not a matter of if but when the next attack would come seemed to hang over everything. The villagers had been trained for this, at least in theory. The government's propaganda had been clear: Britain would stand firm, unyielding in the face of any assault. The people were told to stay calm, to be resolute. But there was no amount of rhetoric that could erase the chilling reality that, at any given moment, the enemy might arrive overhead, casting bombs and destruction down upon them like a force of nature they had no power to stop. As the day wore on, the village became a curious blend of business as usual and a quiet, underlying fear. The women, many of whom had been left behind to care for their children, continued with the daily tasks of life. The shops opened their doors, the bakers' ovens still produced warm loaves of bread, and the farmers tended their fields. but there was an unnatural slowness to everything. People glanced up nervously at the sky more often than they normally would have, their eyes scanning for any sign of movement, any shadow in the sky that might herald another attack. The normal hum of daily life was interrupted by the occasional, nervous laugh, the casual, forced small talk between neighbors who tried to pretend that everything was fine, but their eyes told a different story. Children wandered out into the open, unsure of whether to go back to their games or to simply wait for the inevitable next round of terror. The older children, those who had been raised on tales of bravery and the unwavering spirit of their ancestors, tried to reassure the younger ones. "We'll be fine," they said, though there was an edge to their words that betrayed their own uncertainty. They had learned to mimic their parents' stoicism, but underneath, they, too, were afraid. The mothers, on the other hand, moved with a quiet purpose, their faces set in a way that suggested they were trying to master their own fear for the sake of their children. They had learned how to endure hardship, but this was something new. War, in all its forms, was a beast unlike any other, one that didn't show its face until it was already too late. Even as the day continued, the village remained eerily silent in its own way. The streets were emptier than usual, though people still went about their business. The children's laughter was quieter, tinged with an underlying tension, as if they knew that the world they had once known could be taken away in an instant. The clattering of a cart's wheels over cobblestones seemed louder than ever, the sound ringing in the otherwise still air. The quiet conversations between the adults often turned to the events of the previous night. "Did you hear the planes?" one man might ask another, his voice low. They were close. The women, too, exchanged worried glances as they hung their laundry on clotheslines, watching the sky in a way that betrayed their attempts at nonchalance. The familiarity of their routines gave way to the constant awareness of the unknown, the feeling that the next bomb might fall at any second. By mid-afternoon, the village had settled into an uncomfortable routine. People were no longer rushing to and from their tasks, but rather carrying out their duties with a kind of solemn purpose, as if they were all working in slow motion, each task dragging out longer than it needed to. The children returned to their makeshift games, though they did so with less energy than before. The older boys played at being soldiers, reenacting the battles they had heard about in the news, but their enthusiasm was muted. The girls, too, tried to play, but their giggles were strained, and their eyes constantly flickered upward, half expecting to see the telltale streaks of warplanes cutting through the sky. The games were not as carefree as they once were. The innocence that had marked these children's childhoods seemed to be slipping away, replaced by a kind of forced maturity that didn't belong to them. As nightfall began to settle over the village again, the fear returned, sharper this time. The adults moved more quickly now, gathering their children close, checking their emergency supplies. The shelters, those hastily constructed refuges, stood as silent reminders of the dangers that still loomed overhead. The once quiet fields that lay at the edge of the village now seemed distant, alien, as if the world beyond had ceased to exist. The shelter was no longer just a place to hide. It had become a symbol of survival. Inside, the villagers huddled together in the familiar darkness, their faces illuminated only by the dim glow of lanterns. There was little conversation now. Everyone knew what was coming, but no one knew when. The silence of the shelter was a deafening one, a kind of shared waiting, as if the entire village had collectively held its breath, waiting for the storm to break. This time, the children were not as quick to fall asleep as they had been before. They lay awake on the cold stone floors, staring up at the low beams above them, listening for the sounds of the planes, the bombs, the explosions that they were all sure would come. Some whispered softly to each other, their voices shaking with fear, while others simply lay in stillness, eyes wide open in the dark. The mothers whispered reassurances, though they themselves were unsure of what to say. Their children could sense the fear in their voices, even if they did not fully understand it. And so, the cycle continued, the wait, the fear, the silence, and the knowing that it could all be over in a flash. Outside, the darkened sky seemed to stretch on forever. The stars were barely visible through the thick clouds that hung low, and the air was heavy with a kind of oppressive stillness. The sound of distant planes had become a constant hum, now more familiar, yet just as terrifying. The people of the village had learned to live with this new rhythm, this uneasy blend of waiting and surviving, but it was wearing them down. The fear of what might come was just as overwhelming as the fear of the unknown. Each passing hour added weight to their shoulders, and with every minute that ticked by, the idea that they might never feel safe again grew stronger. It was a quiet kind of trauma, the kind that didn't announce itself with loud cries, but settled in slowly until it was impossible to ignore. And yet, despite the fear that had taken root in the hearts of the villagers, there was something deeper that kept them going. It wasn't hope, not exactly, not the kind of hope that burned brightly in the face of danger, but something quieter, something more enduring. It was patience. A patience born not of optimism, but of survival. The British had faced adversity for centuries, and in this moment, they would face it again. In the face of the unknown, they would wait. And wait. And wait. Because that was what they had learned to do. And it was that patience, not the power of any weapon or army, that would ultimately determine how long they could endure. The night passed slowly, each minute a reminder of how far they had already come and how much further they would need to go. But when the first light of dawn finally broke through the cracks of the shelter, there was no attack. The planes did not come. The sky was clear. The all-clear siren sounded, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the people of the village stepped outside to find themselves in a world that had not been destroyed. But even as they breathed a collective sigh of relief, they knew, somewhere deep inside, that this moment of peace was only temporary. The war had not yet passed them by. It was still out there, waiting, and the waiting would continue. The next morning, the village woke to a calm that felt almost surreal. The sun rose lazily over the horizon, casting a soft golden light over the fields that had once been symbols of peaceful abundance. But now, as the rays of the new day slowly crept across the land, it was clear that the world had changed. The villagers, shaken by the previous night's warning, moved quietly through their daily routines, though everything now seemed imbued with a different gravity. The sounds of the birds that once heralded the dawn were muted, as if even nature itself was holding its breath. Life continued, but the undercurrent of fear that had settled in the village the night before still clung to every movement. The day began much as any other. Women washed clothes by the well, men worked in the fields, and children, though with noticeably less energy than before, began their slow return to their makeshift games. But despite their best efforts, the villagers could not escape the growing awareness that the war had already touched them. The reality of their situation was unavoidable. For years, they had heard rumors of conflict brewing across the continent, and though they had felt the tremors of its approach, they had convinced themselves that their corner of the world would remain untouched. But the events of the previous night had shattered that illusion. Now, as the morning wore on and the day unfolded, each passing hour felt like a gift, fragile and fleeting. The clock seemed to tick louder, the minutes stretching, each one a reminder that the next air raid could be just a breath away. As the hours passed, the village settled into a new rhythm, one marked by quiet vigilance. The daily tasks, once a comfort, now felt mechanical, almost hollow. Women hurried through their chores, eyes darting up to the sky more often than they should have. The men worked, but their conversations were now tinged with unease. Even the children seemed quieter, their laughter more hesitant, their games somehow less spontaneous. They had been taught to be resilient, to be tough in the face of adversity, but the uncertainty of the future left them with questions they could not yet answer. There was an unspoken understanding among the villagers. They were waiting. Waiting for something they couldn't name. The war was out there, in the distance, but they felt it pressing closer with each passing hour. It had already begun to change them. And yet, there was no choice but to wait for the inevitable, to endure the uncertainty that weighed on their hearts like a heavy stone. For the children, the waiting was a strange sort of torture. They were old enough to understand that something terrible was happening, but they were too young to comprehend the scale of it. They could see the fear in their parents' eyes, hear the hushed conversations at the dinner table, and feel the quiet tension that hung in the air. But there was no way to explain it to them, not in a way that made sense. The parents, for their part, tried to reassure their children, though their own nerves were frayed. They had grown accustomed to the threats that had hung over them in the past: wars, famine, and economic hardship, But none of those had felt as immediate, as close as this war did. They had lived through the hardships of life before, but this was different. This was a global conflict, a battle that would determine the fate of nations. It was not something that could be ignored, something that could simply be weathered. It was coming, and it was coming for them. In the afternoon, as the village seemed to breathe in unison, a strange stillness descended over the landscape. The sky, once clear and inviting, had become overcast, the clouds gathering like a shroud of impending doom. The children, their curiosity now tempered by the shadows of fear, had retreated into their homes. There was no more play, no more laughter. The war had stolen that from them. The adults, too, moved more cautiously, as though their every step was weighed down by the knowledge that something was about to happen, though no one knew exactly what. It was a waiting game, and everyone was playing it, whether they wanted to or not. Even the animals seemed affected by the change. The dogs, once carefree and full of energy, now stayed close to their owners, their ears alert to every sound, every footstep. The cows in the fields had become skittish, as though they, too, sensed the tension in the air. The familiar rhythms of life had been replaced by a low hum of unease that seemed to permeate everything, from the soft rustling of the trees to the quiet murmur of the village's conversations. It was a disquiet that could not be ignored. As the afternoon wore on, the sun disappeared behind thick clouds, casting a gray pallor over the village. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of distant smoke. The air felt heavier, laden with the expectation of something terrible. The villagers had already learned to read the signs. They knew that the war would not wait for them to be ready. It would arrive on its own time, and they would have no choice but to face it head-on. The sounds of distant planes became a regular fixture in the sky, their engines droning overhead like a reminder that the enemy was never far away. But despite the constant threat, nothing had yet happened. The village remained in a state of suspended animation, its people poised between fear and hope, between survival and surrender. Night fell once more, and with it came the familiar routine. The all-clear siren had sounded earlier, signaling that the immediate danger had passed, but the villagers knew better than to believe that the night would be any less perilous than the last. As they moved into the shelter, the weight of their uncertainty settled around them like a heavy cloak. There was no warmth in the shelter tonight, no sense of security. The walls, once a symbol of protection, now seemed to close in on them, each breath echoing off the cold stone. The children, too, were quiet, their eyes wide and watchful, though they were too afraid to ask the questions that had been swirling in their minds since the sirens first wailed. The parents, too, lay awake, though their thoughts were not of comfort but of what might be coming next. They could hear the sounds of distant planes, but nothing materialized. Still, the tension remained, like an invisible force pressing down on them from every side. There was no way to escape it. There was no place to hide from the uncertainty that now dominated their lives. The enemy, in a sense, was no longer just the planes overhead or the bombs falling in other parts of the country. The true enemy was the waiting. The waiting, with all its fear and apprehension, was the thing that gnawed at their spirits, eating away at their resolve. And yet, despite the oppressive weight of fear, something else had begun to take root in the hearts of the villagers. A quiet, stubborn resilience. They had lived through countless hardships before, and they knew that this, too, would eventually pass. The enemy would come, but they would not be broken. They would wait it out. They would endure. In the dead of night, as the village settled into a tense and uneasy sleep, there was a shift in the air. The low rumble of distant planes grew louder, closer, until it seemed to fill the sky. The sound was deafening, but still, there was no sign of the attack. The village waited, its collective breath held, for something that might never come. But the waiting had become a part of them now. It had woven itself into the fabric of their lives, like a dark thread that could not be untangled. No one knew when the storm would hit, or if it would ever come at all. All they knew was that they could not escape it. All they could do was wait. As the morning light began to creep in once again, the planes were gone. The war had not come to the village that night. Yet still, the tension remained. It was not over. It was only just beginning. And so, the villagers, battered but unbroken, went on with their lives, caught in the rhythm of waiting. The war had not reached them in full force yet, but they knew it would. They would be ready, even if it meant facing their fear day after day, night after night, until the inevitable came. Until the waiting, at last, came to an end. The day began like any other, with the sun rising over the quiet village and spilling its pale light across the rolling hills and the fields where the farmers worked, their backs bent with the labor that had always defined their lives. But there was something different about today. The air felt heavier, as though it had absorbed all the anxiety and uncertainty that had been building since the war began. For those who had lived through the previous night, the terror that clung to the air felt as if it had only grown more suffocating. The village, though small and isolated from the heart of the conflict, now felt the weight of its proximity to an unseen but inescapable force. People moved about their daily chores, but it was clear to anyone who cared to see, their movements were slower, more deliberate. The small, everyday gestures that had once been carefree were now colored by fear. Inside the homes, mothers and fathers shared a quiet, unspoken understanding. They had seen the fear in their children's eyes, had heard their soft whimpers in the night. The children, once so carefree, had begun to notice the absence of their fathers and the heaviness in their mothers' voices. Some asked questions, innocent ones, about what was happening and why it felt as though the world was holding its breath. But their parents, though anxious themselves, could offer little in response. How could they explain the enormity of the war to a child whose understanding of the world had been so small and beautiful just days ago? How could they answer their questions without giving away their own fear? The silence that had descended over the village was a shared one, carried by both the adults and the children alike. The children, now more aware of the threat around them, played less outside, retreating into the safety of their homes, their eyes constantly scanning the sky for the telltale signs of an attack. Some wandered to the safety of the underground shelters in the early hours of the afternoon, taking comfort in the sense of being protected, even if that protection was nothing more than a fragile illusion. They knew that at any given moment, everything could change. The adults did their best to carry on with the semblance of normalcy, but there was an edge to everything they did. Even the simplest acts, hanging laundry, tending to the animals, or preparing dinner, felt laden with significance. Every movement felt slower, as though the heaviness of waiting was dragging them down. They were no longer just going through the motions of life. They were suspended in a state of anticipation, the kind of waiting that gnawed at the soul, eating away at whatever piece they had left. By afternoon, the air had grown thick with the threat of another raid. The children were told to stay close to home, to remain near their mothers, and yet, despite the warnings, some of them wandered into the open fields, drawn by the unfamiliar need to see the sky for themselves. But their eyes, always searching the heavens, were now wary. The playful curiosity that had once defined their games had disappeared. Instead, they walked in silence, aware that something was different, something was coming, and they could not escape it. The world they had known, filled with wonder and simple joys, was slipping away, replaced by a dark, foreboding reality that was too much for their young minds to fully grasp. In the homes, the elders spoke less frequently, each trying to mask their growing unease behind a veneer of normality. The sight of empty chairs where fathers should have been, the faint smell of the rations they had been stockpiling, the quiet ticking of clocks, all of it combined to create a kind of stillness that felt unnatural because it was so full of quiet anxiety. The children picked at their food, no longer able to enjoy even the simplest of meals, their appetites dulled by the anticipation of what might come. They wanted to ask questions, but no one had the answers. Even the adults, usually the strong ones, the ones with the wisdom and the knowledge to lead, had been stripped of their certainty. They could offer no more than hollow reassurances, words that seemed to fall flat in the face of an enemy they could not name. As the afternoon gave way to evening, the sky darkened earlier than it had the day before. The sun, once warm and welcoming, now seemed distant, covered by a shroud of gray clouds that hung heavy in the air. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees, carrying with it the promise of more fear. The village, though small and unassuming, now seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the next bomb to fall. The distant sound of planes became an ever-present reminder that danger was still on the horizon. It was not the sound of planes that caused the most fear. It was the silence that followed, the endless waiting, the feeling that at any moment, the heavens above could crack open and spill destruction down upon them. The air was filled with a constant hum, the low sound of engines approaching, then receding, followed by the dreadful silence that followed. The children, even those who had spent the previous day playing and laughing, now huddled together in the safety of their homes. Their faces, once filled with the innocence of youth, were now etched with a quiet, anticipatory dread. They had learned the power of silence, of staying still, of listening to the world around them. The world they had known was shrinking, and with every passing moment, they were growing older, understanding more than they ever should have had to. Some of the younger ones who had not fully understood the war before, now looked to the older children for guidance. They watched their older siblings with wide eyes, as though expecting them to have the answers to questions they were too scared to ask. But the older children, too, were learning that there were no easy answers in a world at war. There were only moments of waiting, of being suspended in a place between fear and survival, where the lines between the two became indistinguishable. As night fell, the shelter once again became the center of activity. The village, which had been so full of life just days ago, now seemed to retreat into itself. The sounds of laughter and conversation that had been commonplace were replaced by whispers and nervous glances. The shelter was crowded with people, all seeking the comfort of their own community, all silently willing the night to pass without incident. The children huddled close to their mothers, some of them too frightened to speak, too frightened to move. Others, older and wiser in their fear, lay still, staring up at the low beams of the shelter, as though willing themselves to disappear into the dark corners of their minds. There was no comfort in the shelter, no promise that it would protect them from the terror that might come. For hours, the only sounds in the shelter were the muted voices of the adults, the occasional shift of a restless body, and the distant rumble of the planes. The silence in the shelter was broken only by the sound of deep, drawn-out breaths as people tried to calm themselves, tried to push away the gnawing terror that threatened to consume them. But nothing could distract them from the sense of waiting. No one spoke of it, but everyone knew what it was. The waiting was as real as the planes that roared overhead, as real as the distant explosions that shook the ground beneath them. It was a waiting game that no one could win. It was not a matter of endurance, but of survival. In the end, they could only wait to see who would be left standing. When the night stretched on, deep and unyielding, the villagers could feel the edges of their resolve starting to fray. The constant hum of the planes, the distant sound of explosions, all of it seemed to fade into the background, swallowed by the weight of fear that hung in the air. The children, no longer able to bear the silence, began to ask questions again. "Why are we waiting?" one of them asked, their voice barely a whisper in the dark. But no one had an answer. They could not explain the waiting. They could not explain the fear that clung to them, the unease that refused to be shaken off. As the night dragged on, it felt like time itself had slowed down, stretching the moments into hours. There was no way to know when the planes would return, when the bombs would drop, when the war would finally find them. All they could do was wait. And in the waiting, they found their greatest test of strength. It wasn't the fear of the planes or the bombs, but the silence, the unbearable silence, that had the power to break them. It was the waiting that threatened to wear them down, to take everything from them until nothing remained but fear itself. Yet, in the midst of that waiting, they also found something else, a quiet determination, a resilience that was forged not in the certainty of victory, but in the willingness to endure. And so, they waited. The village, still and silent in the night, waited for the inevitable. The world outside seemed to hold its breath, as did they. The waiting was the enemy now, as much as the planes or the bombs. But in the waiting, they learned that survival was not just about escaping danger, it was about holding on, no matter how dark the night became. The morning after the long, agonizing night passed with no attack, the village emerged from its shelters in a strange, tentative relief. The sun rose, casting light upon a world that still seemed full of potential, though it was undoubtedly different from the one they had known before. The fear that had tightly gripped their hearts seemed to ease slightly, but it was not gone. The air felt different, as though it, too, had been holding its breath. The villagers, Many of them stepping cautiously out into the daylight, exchanged looks that conveyed a mix of exhaustion, wariness, and something else, something more elusive. For some, it was a brief sense of victory, that they had survived the night without disaster. For others, it was a feeling of anxiety, the kind that clung to them because they knew the war was still out there, still waiting to reach them, but now, it had somehow grown more personal. The distant bombs, the sounds of planes, all of it felt closer, more immediate. The waiting, they realized, would never be truly over.